There's something you don't say out loud. Because even thinking it feels wrong. You meet someone who treats you well. They're kind. They're consistent. They don't disappear. They don't confuse you. And for a moment, you think, this is what I've been looking for. But then something shifts. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. You stop feeling it. There's no excitement. No emotional pull. No urgency to check your phone. No need to replay conversations in your head. You're there. But something inside you isn't. And that thought starts to grow. Why don't I feel anything? And the worst part is, you can't explain it. Because this person didn't do anything wrong. They're doing everything right. And maybe that's exactly what makes it so confusing. Because when someone is calm, when they're stable, when they're emotionally available, something inside you goes quiet. Too quiet. And that silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something is missing. If this feels familiar, if part of you has been here before without knowing how to explain it, then this channel is for you. Because here, we try to put words into patterns you felt, but never fully understood. So you start questioning everything. Maybe I'm not into them. Maybe something's off. Maybe this just isn't it. But what if this isn't about them at all? What if the problem isn't that you don't feel, but that you learn to recognize love only when it feels intense? If you look at it from the outside, nothing is wrong. This person shows up. They text you back. Not in a rushed way. Not in an anxious way. Just, consistently. They remember things you say. They ask about your day. They listen when you talk. You don't have to guess what they feel. You don't have to analyze every message. You don't have to wonder if they're going to disappear. There are no mixed signals. No emotional games. No sudden distance that makes you question everything. And at first, that feels good. Almost like relief. Because maybe you're tired. Tired of trying to figure people out. Tired of reading between the lines. Tired of feeling like you have to earn someone's attention. So when something simple appears, something stable, something clear, you tell yourself, this is different. This is what I needed. This is healthy. And it is. But then something begins to shift. Not in a way you can point to. Not something you can explain. Just small changes. You stop checking your phone as much. You don't feel that urge to reread conversations. You don't feel pulled to respond immediately. There's no anticipation building inside you. No tension. No emotional high. And without that, something inside you starts to go quiet. At first, it feels like peace. Like your mind can finally rest. But then, it changes. That quiet becomes noticeable. And then, uncomfortable. Because you're not used to it. You're used to feeling something. Even if that something was anxiety. Even if that something was uncertainty. Even if that something kept you overthinking for hours. At least it made you feel engaged. Present. Alive. But now, there's nothing pushing your attention. Nothing pulling you in. Nothing making you feel like you need to hold on to something. And instead of feeling safe, you start to feel disconnected. Not from them. From yourself. Like you're there, but not fully inside the experience. Like something is missing, but you can't name what it is. You might be sitting next to them, having a normal conversation. And suddenly, a thought appears. Why don't I feel more? It's quiet. almost subtle. But it stays. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. You start paying attention to it. Moments where you should feel something, but don't. Moments that should feel meaningful, but feel neutral. And that neutrality becomes heavy. Because it doesn't match what you expect love to feel like. So your mind starts trying to explain it. Maybe I'm not that into them. Maybe something is missing. Maybe they're not the right person. And the more you think about it, the more real it feels. Because your body isn't reacting the way it used to. There's no adrenaline. No emotional spikes. No urgency. And without that, your system reads it as lack of connection. Even if nothing is actually wrong. And without realizing it, you begin to compare. Not consciously, but emotionally. You remember what it felt like before. The relationships that consumed you. The ones where you couldn't stop thinking about the other person. Where every message mattered. Where every delay felt like something was wrong. Where your emotions were always moving. Up and down. Back and forth. And even if that hurt. Even if it made you anxious. Even if it made you feel unstable. It felt like something. It felt intense. It felt real. And now, this doesn't. So slowly, you begin to pull away. Not in a dramatic way. Not with a clear decision. Just small things. You take longer to reply. You stop initiating conversations as much. You feel less interested in seeing them. Not because they did something wrong. But because you don't feel pulled. And that lack of pull becomes your explanation. I don't feel it. I can't force it. It's just not there. But what you don't see is that what's missing is not connection. It's the activation your system got used to. The emotional movement. The internal noise. Because in your past, love didn't feel calm. It felt uncertain. Something you had to think about. Something you had to figure out. Something you had to hold on to. And that created a kind of tension inside you. A constant awareness. A need to stay emotionally engaged. And that engagement felt like connection. Now, there's no tension. No instability. No emotional guessing. And your system doesn't quite know what to do with that. Because calm doesn't activate you. It doesn't pull your attention. It doesn't create that inner movement you learn to associate with love. So instead of feeling safe, you feel disconnected. And that's where the confusion begins. Because from the outside, everything is right. But from the inside, something feels off. And when that feeling grows strong enough, you don't question the pattern. You question the connection. And you start to step back. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't feel like what you recognize. And if this has happened more than once, if you felt this before, then maybe it's not really about the people you meet. Maybe it's about something deeper. Something your system learned a long time ago. Before you even had words for it. Because this didn't start in your relationships. It started much earlier. Long before you knew what love was supposed to feel like. Your body was already learning what to expect from it. Not through words. Not through explanations. But through experience. Through what was present. And what was missing. Because as a child, you don't analyze love. You absorb it. You don't ask, is this healthy? You feel. Am I safe here? Do I have to adjust myself to stay close? Is connection something I can trust, or something I can lose? And whatever the answer is, Your system adapts. Quietly. Automatically. Without you even noticing. Maybe love didn't feel stable. Maybe it felt inconsistent. Some days there was warmth, attention, closeness. And other days, something shifted. Distance. Silence. Emotional absence. And you didn't understand why. You just felt it. That uncertainty. That sense that something could change at any moment. And because you needed that connection, you started paying attention. Closely. You learned to read subtle changes. Tone of voice. Facial expressions. Energy in the room. You became sensitive, not because you were too much, but because your environment required it. Because connection wasn't guaranteed. It had to be noticed. Protected. Maintained. Or maybe love came with expectations. You were appreciated, but conditionally. When you behaved well. When you didn't create problems. When you adapted. And without realizing it, you learned something very specific. Love is something you earn. Not something you receive freely. So you adjusted. You became attentive. Responsible. Careful. You learned how to be what was needed. Instead of simply being yourself. Or maybe there was emotional intensity. Not necessarily something extreme. But enough unpredictability to create movement. Moments of closeness. Followed by tension. Warmth. Followed by distance. And your system adapted to that rhythm. Up and down. Near and far. Present and absent. And that rhythm became familiar. Recognizable. The important part is not the exact situation. It's what your body learned from it. Because your body doesn't store explanations. It stores patterns. It stores sensations. It stores associations. And one of the most important associations it creates is this. What does connection feel like? Does it feel calm? Or does it feel activating? Does it feel stable? Or does it feel uncertain? Does it feel safe? Or does it feel like something you need to maintain? If connection came with uncertainty, your system learned that uncertainty means connection. If connection required effort, your system learned that effort means love. If connection involved emotional ups and downs, your system learned that intensity means closeness. And over time, these associations became automatic. You don't think them. You feel them. And if you're starting to recognize yourself in this, if part of you is realizing that this didn't start in your relationships, then this is exactly what this space is for. Because most people never hear this explained in a way that actually connects to what they feel. And when you start to see it, things that once felt confusing begin to make sense in a different way. So now, in your adult life, when you meet someone who is calm, consistent, emotionally available, your mind might say, "This is good." But your body says, "This is unfamiliar." And unfamiliar doesn't always feel safe. Sometimes, it feels empty. Because there's no activation. No tension. No need to monitor. No need to adjust. No need to chase. And without those elements, your system doesn't fully recognize the experience as meaningful. That's why calm love can feel confusing. Because it doesn't match what your system learned to associate with connection. It doesn't trigger the same internal responses. It doesn't create that emotional movement you're used to. And without that movement, you feel less. Not because there is less there, but because your system isn't responding the way it learned to. Think about how your body reacts. When someone is unpredictable, you pay attention. You think more. You feel more. You become more emotionally engaged, even if what you feel is anxiety. Now compare that to someone who is stable. There's no urgency. No emotional spikes. No need to figure anything out. And your system slows down. But instead of interpreting that as safety, you interpret it as absence. Because in your experience, feeling something strongly was always part of being connected. So now, when that intensity isn't there, it feels like something is missing, even when nothing is wrong. And this is how the pattern begins to take shape. Not as a conscious decision, but as an emotional response. You move toward what activates you, and away from what doesn't. You feel drawn to what creates tension, and disconnected from what feels calm. Not because you want to be hurt, but because your system recognizes that feeling. It knows how to exist there. And without realizing it, you begin to confuse two very different things: activation and connection. And that confusion doesn't stay in the past. It follows you into your choices, into your relationships, into the way you feel, even when everything seems right. And if your system keeps responding this way, even when you consciously want something different, then the question is no longer just where this came from, but how this pattern keeps repeating itself in your life today, in ways that are much harder to see than you think. And this is where it becomes harder to see, because the pattern doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like your experience. It feels like something that just happens. Like you keep meeting the same kind of person. Like things start well, and then slowly fall apart. Like you don't understand why it keeps repeating. But if you look closely, there's a sequence. It doesn't start with logic. It starts with attraction. You meet someone, and you feel something immediately. Not calm interest. Not something neutral. Something stronger. A pull. A curiosity. An emotional tension that draws you in. Maybe they're a little distant. A little hard to read. Not fully available. And instead of pushing you away, that pulls you closer. Because your system recognizes something. Not consciously, but emotionally. You start thinking about them more than expected. Replaying conversations. Reading between the lines. Trying to understand what they meant. Waiting for messages. Checking your phone. Feeling something build inside you. And that feeling feels like connection. Like interest. Like something real. But if you slow down and look at it, a lot of that feeling isn't coming from what they're giving you. It's coming from what you're trying to understand. From the uncertainty. From the space between what is clear and what is missing. And that space activates you. It creates movement. It pulls your attention. It keeps you emotionally engaged. Now compare that to someone who is clear. Someone who shows interest. Who responds. Who doesn't leave you guessing. At first, that feels easy. Comfortable. Even relieving. But very quickly, it becomes quiet. Predictable. Still. And without realizing it, you lose that pull. Not because they're lacking something, but because there's nothing to solve. Nothing to decode. Nothing to chase. And without that, Your system slows down. And that slowing down feels like disconnection. So what happens next? You start to disengage. But not in an obvious way. Not all at once. In small, almost invisible ways. You take longer to reply. You feel less excited to see them. You stop initiating as much. You start noticing small things that bother you. Things that, in another context, might not even matter. And your mind begins to create a narrative. Something feels off. I don't think this is it. I'm not feeling what I should feel. And because that feeling is real, you trust it. You follow it. So you step back. Or you slowly let it fade. And then, time passes. And you meet someone else. And this time, you feel it again. That intensity. That pull. That emotional activation. And it feels right. Because it feels familiar. But along with that, comes the same pattern. You start overthinking. You start feeling uncertain. You start questioning where you stand. You feel the distance. And instead of stepping back, you lean in. You try more. You think more. You feel more. Because your system is activated. And activation feels like connection. So even when it hurts, it feels real. And this is where the loop completes. You feel deeply connected to someone who is not fully available. And you feel disconnected from someone who is. And from the inside, this feels confusing, contradictory, almost impossible to explain. You might find yourself thinking, why do I always end up here? Why do I lose interest in good people? Why do I feel more for the ones who don't choose me? And the answers don't come easily. Because you're looking at the people. At the situations. But the pattern isn't in them. It's in how your system responds. And that response is automatic. It doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't wait for logic. It reacts. Based on what it learned. So even when you try to choose differently, your feelings don't always follow. You might tell yourself, this time I'll do it differently. This time I'll choose someone stable. But when you're actually there, in front of someone calm, something inside you goes quiet again. And that quiet feels wrong. So you interpret it as lack of connection. And you move away. Not because you want to repeat the pattern. But because it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like your truth. And that's what makes it so hard to break. Because you're not consciously choosing chaos. You're responding to what feels real. And what feels real is what activates you. So you keep moving toward intensity. And away from calm. Even when one drains you. And the other could actually support you. And over time, this creates a kind of confusion inside you. Where you stop trusting your own feelings. Because what you feel doesn't always lead you somewhere that sustains you. And what could sustain you doesn't always feel like something you want. So you end up in between. Wanting something stable. But not feeling it. Wanting connection. But only recognizing it when it comes with tension. And that tension between what you want and what you feel keeps repeating. Until something changes. Not outside, but inside. Because the pattern doesn't break. When you meet someone different, it begins to shift. When you start seeing what's happening while it's happening. When you start noticing what pulls you in, what makes you lose interest, what makes you stay, what makes you leave. Not as random reactions, but as learned responses. And once you begin to see that, even slightly, something new becomes possible. Not immediate change, but awareness. And that awareness creates space. A space between what you feel and what you choose. And inside that space, something different can begin. Because if what you feel is shaped by patterns your system learned, then understanding how those patterns actually work might be the only way to stop confusing intensity with connection. And finally start seeing what real connection actually feels like. Because once you begin to see this pattern, it raises a different kind of question. Not, why is this happening to me? But, why does this feel like connection in the first place? And to understand that, you don't need complicated theory. You just need to look at how your system learned to respond. Your emotional system doesn't measure love the way your mind does. It doesn't ask, is this healthy? Is this good for me? Is this stable? It asks something much simpler. Does this feel familiar? Because familiarity is what your system associates with safety. Even when that familiarity comes from something that hurt you. So when you feel drawn to someone who creates uncertainty, it's not random. It's recognition. Your system is recognizing a pattern it already knows. And because it knows how to respond to it. That's why intensity feels so powerful. Because intensity activates your system. It creates emotional movement. It pulls your attention. It keeps you engaged. And your brain interprets that activation as meaning, as importance, as connection. But what's actually happening is something different. You're not necessarily responding to the person. You're responding to the emotional state they create in you. And that emotional state feels familiar. This is where attachment comes in. Not as a label, but as a pattern. If your early experiences of connection were inconsistent, your system learned to stay alert, to pay attention, to anticipate changes. That creates what we call anxious activation. But you don't experience it as a label. You experience it as thinking more, feeling more, wanting more, needing clarity. And all of that feels like connection. On the other side, when someone is consistent, predictable, emotionally available, your system doesn't need to activate. There's nothing to anticipate. Nothing to fix. Nothing to hold together. And instead of recognizing that as safety, your system experiences it as absence. Because there's no movement. No emotional spike. No urgency. So calm begins to feel empty. Not because it is, but because it doesn't activate what you learn to associate with connection. And this is where the confusion becomes deeper. Because your mind says, this is what I wanted. But your body says, this doesn't feel like anything. And when those two don't match, You tend to trust what you feel. Not because it's more accurate, but because it's more immediate. So you move toward what activates you, and away from what doesn't. And over time, this creates a very specific internal dynamic. You begin to associate intensity with love, uncertainty with interest, emotional tension with connection. And at the same time, you begin to associate calm with disconnection, stability with boredom, availability with lack of feeling. And none of this is conscious. You don't think, I prefer intensity. You feel, this feels right. And that's what makes the pattern so strong. Because it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like your natural response. But there's something important happening underneath all of this. Your system is not trying to hurt you. It's trying to recreate what it understands. It's trying to find connection. In the only way it learned how. Even if that way is exhausting. Even if that way creates pain. Because from your system's perspective, painful familiarity feels safer than unfamiliar calm. And that's why stable love can feel so difficult to trust. Not because it's lacking something, but because it doesn't match the internal blueprint you've been using. And when something doesn't match that blueprint, your system doesn't immediately recognize it as safe. It experiences it as neutral, or even empty. And this is where many people get stuck. Because they interpret that feeling as truth. This isn't love. I don't feel it. This must not be right. But what they're actually feeling is the absence of activation. And the absence of activation can feel like the absence of connection. Even when connection is there. So the real shift doesn't come from forcing yourself to feel something different. It comes from understanding what your system is doing while you're feeling it. From noticing the difference between what activates you and what actually supports you. From seeing that intensity is not the same as connection, and calm is not the same as emptiness. And when that distinction begins to become clearer, even slightly, something inside you starts to reorganize. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough for you to pause. Enough for you to question. Is this really connection? Or just activation? And in that question, something new begins to form. A different way of relating. A different way of interpreting what you feel. Because maybe what you've been calling nothing was never really nothing. Maybe it was something quieter. Something unfamiliar. Something your system hasn't fully learned to recognize yet. And if that's true, then the challenge isn't learning how to feel more. It's learning how to recognize what you've been overlooking. Because what feels empty might not be empty at all. It might just be the first time your system isn't being pulled by intensity, but invited into something it doesn't fully understand yet. And that discomfort, that quiet, that lack of urgency, might not be a sign that something is missing. It might be the first sign that something is finally different. So maybe this isn't about something being missing. Maybe it's about something being unfamiliar. Because for a long time, you learned to recognize love through movement, through intensity, through emotional shifts, through the feeling that something could change at any moment. And that made you feel present, engaged, alive. But what if what you've been calling alive was actually activation? And what you've been calling empty was something your system hasn't learned to recognize yet? Because calm doesn't ask for your attention the same way. It doesn't pull you in. It doesn't create urgency. It just stays. And when something simply stays, without forcing you to react, without making you chase, without making you question, it can feel like nothing is happening. But maybe something is happening, just not in the way you're used to noticing. Maybe for the first time, your system isn't trying to hold on to something. It isn't trying to fix something. It isn't trying to understand something that keeps changing. And without that effort, you feel the absence of movement. And that absence feels like emptiness. But what if it's not emptiness? What if it's space? Space where there used to be tension. Space where there used to be overthinking. Space where there used to be emotional noise. And that space can feel uncomfortable, because you're not used to being in it. You're used to filling it with thoughts, with questions, with emotional reactions. So when that space appears, you don't immediately experience it as peace. You experience it as something missing. And that's where the confusion lives. Because from the outside, nothing is wrong. But from the inside, something feels different. And instead of staying with that difference, you've learned to move away from it. To return to what feels recognizable. Even if that recognition comes with anxiety. Even if it comes with uncertainty. Even if it comes with pain. Because at least there, you know how to feel. But maybe this isn't about going back. Maybe it's about slowly learning how to stay. Not forcing yourself to feel something. Not trying to convince yourself that this is right. Just noticing. Noticing the moment where you start to disconnect. Noticing the urge to pull away. Noticing the thought that says, "This isn't enough." And instead of immediately following it, just staying there a little longer. Not to fix it. Not to change it. Just to see it. Because the pattern doesn't begin with your actions. It begins with what you feel. And for a long time, what you felt has guided everything. But now, there's a possibility to relate to that feeling differently. Not by ignoring it. Not by fighting it. But by understanding it. By recognizing that what feels empty might not actually be empty. It might just be quiet. And quiet doesn't always feel like love at first. But that doesn't mean it isn't. It just means your system is still learning how to recognize something new. And maybe, for now, that's enough. Not clarity. Not certainty. Just the awareness that what you feel might not be the full story. And that the absence of intensity doesn't mean the absence of connection. It might just mean you're standing in something different. Something that doesn't demand your attention, but allows you to be there, without losing yourself. And if that feels unfamiliar, Maybe that's exactly why it matters.